Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's focus, I've recently started to whittle through my backlog and realized that I had a rather odd title in my list, namely Developer Dreadbits Seraph, an action platformer that sees you engaging the hordes of hell as a gun-toting seraphim. But here's the question, did this bullet-riddled ballet leave me on cloud 9, or was this a disaster of biblical proportions? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The Corangelus facility was perhaps the pinnacle of human innovation, a massive edifice built to serve as God's temple. And yet, there's a far more literal aspect to this house of God, as within its guts a seraph lays imprisoned. That is, until a demonic incursion arises and provides the perfect opportunity for its celestial guests to make their escape. Though, that's only scratching the surface of this story. See, despite all hell breaking loose, the Seraph isn't quite alone in her escape. First is the Guide, a mysterious entity which plays true to its namesake, and which seems to know more about the events which occurred than it's letting on. That said, it's not long before you'll also find yourself contacted by the Corangelus' overseer, Ava Nazari, who's far less surprised with your arrival and the outbreak than she ought to be. Essentially, these conversations are the primary means by which the story develops. A carrot to chase as you ramp through the stages, and honestly, with the relatively quick-paced nature of each level, it does a decent job of punctuating the action without overloading you with exposition. That said, if you strictly rely on these for narrative, you'll find yourself missing out on a lot of what's going on, because all of the game's backstory is tucked away in the game's collectible lore. In total, there's 75 of these journal entries to pursue, and given that there can only be one spawned in a stage and they aren't even guaranteed, it'll actually take you several playthroughs to find them all, but they do gradually paint a more comprehensive picture of the main cast, as well as introducing some new characters, with one even having an arc that seemed almost akin to sequel bait. Which is sort of laughable in hindsight, given that Seraph culminates in a choice between two endings and provides neither. That's right, there is no real ending to the game, and whatever choice you pick at the climax is utterly irrelevant, as it simply cuts to credits. The end. It was actually a pretty big letdown when I initially got there, and a fairly large part of why I kept whittling away at the lore logs in hopes of getting a bit more context, a bit more anything, really. Which meant I got very familiar with Seraph's core gameplay, to the point that its aspirations towards randomness and replayability began to wear a little thin. Not that the basics are bad, our militant messiah actually plays pretty nicely, given that she starts with a double jump, the ability to wall cling and bounce, and an omnidirectional dash with 2 charges that replenishes quickly. Add in the ability to auto-aim alongside infinite ammo pistols, and you'll soon come to realize that her maneuverability is in fact the main focus of the game, as you'll be tasked with weaving between enemy attacks as they fling fists and fireballs your way. Attacks which are, in fact, immediately telegraphed by the icons which appear over the creatures before they happen, though the relatively sparse amount of iframes on your dodge does still demand some degree of finesse, even with the forewarning. Well, if you see them coming, given that the game actually lacks a means of moving the screen, so you'll occasionally eat near unavoidable damage from hopping down to a lower ledge into the path of an enemy that was already throwing an attack at you unseen. That said, the game does actually have a few systems in place to incentivize risk-taking, with the most immediately noticeable one being experience motes dropping during combat. See, unlike the normal motes you can find in the facility, enemies drop supercharged motes upon dying, which rapidly decay in value after their death. So, while you can coax enemies into ambushes or plinkett them from afar, doing so at a major distance will see you earning drastically reduced experience. Admittedly, you can't actually tell if you've collected enough to level up until the end of the stage, but the benefits here are pretty nice, giving you a little bit of extra health as well as access to perks, and it's this latter element I had a bit of a mixed reception to, though I imagine roguelike fans will feel right at home with this system, since you're essentially provided a narrow choice of perks to fill one of your 4 slots for the given run. And you can actually eschew picking something new in order to level up a perk you already have, or just to not pick anything in case you hate everything. which occasionally happens because here's the thing, a lot of the perks that you can pick up have some absolutely terrible scaling or functionality issues, such as the damage shield occasionally not working for several stages even after I spent time maxing it out, and being unable to replace perks just so I could be forced to either live with my bad decisions or reroll my run. A decision that I had to seriously consider because of the other major system in Seraph, namely its dynamic difficulty. Because yes, you can entirely set the difficulty to the basic 1.0 setting, or the harder 4.0, or even the blisteringly grueling 8.0 difficulty. That said, those numbers are far from static, as they slowly ramp up over the course of your playthrough as you collect experience modes, whether or not they're supercharged. And the more you collect without being hit, the more markers you get, which serve as a multiplier to the rate at which the difficulty escalates. And those jumps in difficulty feel meaningful, since not only do enemies gain more health and damage, they'll attack faster, they'll expand their movesets, and more types of elites will show up during the stages, alongside different types of abilities jam-packed with difficulty-specific modifiers, like reflecting your bullets back in your face. Simply put, the enemies can and will outscale you to a rather noticeable degree if you play inefficiently, and you get ample time to bask in the bad feelings given that Seraph can come back to life twice each stage, albeit losing a third of their max health each time, forcing you to face off against increasingly dire circumstances in an increasingly fragile state. That said, resetting isn't really the end of the world, since there is account-based progress. Specifically, as you make your way through the levels, you'll begin to collect shards, and after an early upgrade, monster materials. Shards are a rare drop from monsters, which can be used to purchase either offensive, defensive, or holy oaths, which are the game's skill tree for the Seraph, albeit strictly composed of a number of passive abilities. That said, they also serve as the main incentive to stick with a run as you ramp up in difficulty modifiers, since as you progress, the overall quality of shard drops will improve, something which would otherwise require a whole lot of fusing, alongside the number given, especially since elites tend to drop them as well. Though shards aren't the only benefit, like I said, there's also monster materials which are used to do things like buy additional primary weapons, increase their efficiency, get defensive items, and even new and improved seraphic powers, the latter of which is especially nice since you can choose which two powers to bring with you at the starting screen, and even hop out to the main menu to change these things around, rather than strictly relying on whatever you find in the facility, like the rest of your equipment. Though, you might recall some things I made about the game's randomness early on in the review, and a big part of that is because each of the game's myriad levels are composed of a number of randomly generated rooms where you are tasked with either taking down a mini-boss or a number of terminus fountains. These are just monster spawners. Occasionally there's an armory room which you're able to go and do a little thing where you find a switch and then make your way back to the armory room to get its contents. These are pretty nice, since not only do they provide you either a buff to your attack, your defense, or the experience gained, they also tend to have defensive items and weapons. But here's the thing, that is the gist of the experience, over and over, for something like 25 or 30 stages. And this becomes a bit of a problem once you realize that each of the game's various biomes is essentially just a different coat of paint for the exact same thing, only growing slightly in scale, but not content. And I do mean this, since it won't be long, especially once you start pushing the difficulty level up, until you're engaging with every type of enemy, because there aren't really that many of them, and none of them are biome-specific baddies, really. Essentially, you just unlock access to the full bestiary and then keep murdering your way through them until you get a brief breather at the first boss, and then continue onwards again for another 15 stages or so. It actually got to the point that the most interesting thing that would occur to me in a stage was the occasional ambush rooms, which lock you in a room with rapidly spawning enemies and task you to survive for 60 seconds. Which is actually brutal on high difficulties, but does provide some motes, a shard, and some much needed heals, if you survive it. Which is why it sort of galls me that in a game which needs a bit more variety, they decided to implement a reincarnation system which provides you some small buffs to Seraph and a shiny halo animation around you, in exchange for blowing up all your permanent progress. Does it provide you better potential to farm and push the envelope? Yes. but it doesn't really add anything new. In fact, when I did decide to grind out the shards just to see what reincarnation was like for myself, I actually used that time to check out the daily and weekly challenges, since the daily challenges actually provide some bite-sized events with at least some variety in how to tackle them, and a surplus of shards as a reward. The weekly challenge, on the other hand, pushes this a bit closer to proper roguelite territory, since it starts you out at a run from scratch, minus your account bonuses of the shards you have, and ends the moment you run out of lives, without giving you the opportunity to continue, unlike the main game. A challenge which offers substantially improved rewards over the dailies, but the leaderboards here are highly competitive, especially since they're based on what percent of people you're better than in a listing that struggles to break double digits most weeks. And the scoring here is especially brutal because to actually get that, you need to go and get through these levels without being hit. It's rough. But right, that's essentially my spiel on the mechanics, so I'm overdue to talk graphics. Let's get into it. And, well, while I do genuinely think that Seraph is a good-looking game with a nice-looking bestiary and some overall smooth combat animations, the whole random generation thing factors in again, because the areas will start to blur together over time. In fact, the sort of area sameness started to drive me a bit crazy over time because you actually lack a map during all of this. Really, the only saving grace for me is the fact that I enjoyed listening to the OST during my inevitable jogs around the stage. Not because I couldn't find the objective, the game's at least kind enough to point out mini-bosses and fountains and stage exit, but more because I really wanted to grab as much as possible, and it's pretty easy to overlook chests hidden behind pillars or gates. But yeah, that's the long of things, so let's shorten it down, and the TLDR, I guess, is that the game is fun, but flawed. Unironically, I'd gotten through to the end of the first playthrough, and I'd essentially seen what the game had to offer me. And the main reason I decided to continue investing time into it was by and large my overarching curiosity about the lore. A process that took so much time, it provided me the opportunity to try out the Twitch stream mode, which actually has some fun options for your audience to aid or hinder you, and then the survival mode, and still have time to spare so that I could turn all of my progress into this fucking Halo here. I mean, I do sort of like competing against other people on the leaderboard. I am hoping I will get first place on it eventually, but here's the thing. Regardless of how much I choose to go and hit my head against a brick wall, it doesn't change the fact that my ultimate takeaway for this game is that it's a fumble. Ultimately, something that I could dub as alright, because while its random generation does help to somewhat mix things up, it's ultimately held back a great deal by the relatively lacking diversity in both its biomes, its baddies, just the overall experience. I'd say it's on the whole a bit more of a casual experience, but if you're looking for an action platformer to pick up and play in small bursts, this might scratch that itch, especially since the scale up stages will allow you to make some degree of progress even in a busy schedule, and then just exit. Just fair warning, when the game says controller recommended on the opening screen, it's not kidding. The experience is a bit potatoes on keyboard and mouse, even if you can rebind keys. And for those competitive folks in the audience, there is still a small community to engage with and compete with in the daily and weekly challenges. They're fucking consistent at it. So if you want to try your hands against the hardened veterans hogging the high scoreboard, be my guest. But honestly, I'm still a bit mad about that ending, and I tried to make some attempts to get in contact with Dreadbit to find out what happened and if there was anything more planned, and that went nowhere. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell for Discord savvy folks. There's also a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also, to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.